Iran is sending 4,000 Revolutionary Guards to fight for Assad in Syria, and with regime gains against the rebels. Is the Obama administration plan to send those small arms enough? Some wonder today, why did it take so long? And as Peter said, tomorrow the president will sit down with a major Assad supporter, Russian President Putin, at that G8 summit in Northern Ireland. What can be accomplished at that meeting, if anything? Former U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, Senior Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, and Fox News contributor John Bolton joins us now, as he does every Sunday at this time. Good morning, Ambassador.
Good morning, Eric. Glad to be with you.
Good to see you as always. First, let's start with the new Obama policy, sending those small arms to the rebels. Is it in the nick of time or too little too late?
I think it's actually evidence of the continuing disarray of the Obama policy. I think any serious military observer will tell you that this contribution that Obama is now prepared to make will not make any significant military difference. And in fact, it looks as though Obama was backed into it because of his own rhetoric about the Assad regime using chemical weapons crossing a red line. I don't think we've had a policy in Syria for 2.5 years other than pray that the Russians actually will do something to remove Assad. That was never any part of their strategic vision of the Middle East, nor has it been any part of Iran's strategic vision. So really, from that perspective, nothing has changed. This has always been a conflict where Iran and Russia were on the other side.
Well, what will happen tomorrow when he sits down with Vladimir Putin in Northern Ireland and the side of the G8 meeting and discusses Assad and the future of Syria?
Well, I think actually President Putin should bring the reset button that Hillary Clinton gave him 4 years ago with him and give it back to President Obama, because that's exactly what's going on here. The Russian government has already rejected the evidence that the president relied on regarding Assad's use of chemical weapons. The Russians have said they will ship S-300 air defense systems to Syria, very sophisticated system. They have provided new sales of MiG planes, anti-ship missiles, and they've deployed over a dozen naval vessels out of the Tartus naval base in Syria. The Russians are not going to let Assad go under, and my view is over the last 2.5 years, they were never going to let that happen. And I think President Putin, in his own inimitable way, will tell the president that tomorrow.
Well, what do you think the president will tell Putin, and does that have any sway, or is he going in with a weak hand?
This is what happens when you get a community organizer from Chicago talking to a former KGB agent. That's going to be like two ships passing in the night. And I'm sure the president will emerge thinking, you know, I saw hopeful signs for negotiation there.
Well, you know, you mentioned some criticism of President Bill Clinton, pretty scathing and stinging, saying that if President Obama doesn't do something, he would, quote, look like a wuss, a, quote, total fool, and be lame. I mean, these are pretty astounding comments from the former commander-in-chief talking about his Democratic colleague who he so supported during the Democratic National Convention. What do you think those comments did to the White House, if anything, and what do they mean?
Very astute, that President Clinton. You know, my view is this is the opening sound of the 2016 Democratic presidential nomination effort. And I think what former President Clinton is doing is opening a path for Hillary Clinton in the near future to distance herself from the policies of the Obama administration, certainly on Syria, perhaps on other areas as well. And I think we're going to see this pattern back and forth. It's going to be fun to watch the next 3.5 years as Bill Clinton critiques the Obama administration in its last term.
Well, what about those who would say, Mr. Ambassador, that the president last summer refusing to send small arms, even though Hillary Clinton and David Petraeus reportedly wanted that, you know, that was judicious, cautious, he's doing it in the national interest, not to be drawn into an internal fight in Syria?
Look, in strategic terms, as much of a humanitarian tragedy as Syria is, in strategic terms, it's a sideshow. The issue here is and has been from the get-go the regime in Iran, the world's central banker of international terrorism, eagerly pursuing a nuclear weapons program, which, by the way, it will continue to do despite yesterday's presidential election. That has been the power to worry about in the Middle East, and I think the Obama administration was reluctant to take on the Assad regime in Syria because it knew if it crossed Iran over the Syria issue, it would never get negotiation over Iran's nuclear weapons program, and that was the Obama administration's priority. I've long thought that was a mistake, but I think that's what dominated President Obama's thinking, and I think now you're seeing the consequences of operating under a delusion.
Yeah, and speaking of Iran, newly elected President Hassan Rouhani said to be a reformer, or in your view, just more of the same?
You know, you got to strain pretty hard to find reformers in the leadership in Iran. I remember Rouhani when he was the chief nuclear negotiator about 10 years ago. He was an expert liar. He carried the Ayatollah's waters. He proclaimed publicly that he had deceived the Europeans, that Iran had deceived the Europeans by using the negotiations to buy time to advance their nuclear weapons program. He said it with great disdain. If this is a reformer, then I've got a Brooklyn Bridge to sell you.
All right, well, at least no more Mahmoud Ahmadinejad for now. Ambassador Bolton, as always, good to see you, and thank you for your analysis and insight.
Thank you, Eric.